right, we're ready for Daniel 5 and 6, those two chapters together, as we continue to make our way through the book of Daniel. We're going to bring to an end the first major section of the book, and we'll talk about that here in just a moment. But Daniel 5 and 6. The message of the book, as we have mentioned each time, and will continue to do so, and that is that God rules in the kingdoms of men. Not always is that statement made where the point is being made, and we'll see that in our study tonight. We'll see that in chapter 5, we'll see it in chapter 6. So we saw that principle in chapter 2, we saw it emphasized again in chapter 4, we're going to see it again in chapter 5, talking about Nebuchadnezzar, that God wanted him to know that God rules in the kingdoms of men. We'll see that principle and other places in our chapters today. Here is our outline. This is important because we are showing how the book divides, and we're going to end this first major section. There's a history section, and there's a vision section. So if this is your first time, and it probably is not, your first time to read through the book of Daniel and seriously study the book of Daniel, you're going to be surprised if you haven't read ahead when you get to chapter 7 through 12. It is not the same. The brakes are going to come on, and you're wondering what on earth is going on. It is a totally different section. So we'll get to that next time. That's visions, but each one of these two major sections is divided by period, the Babylonian period and the Persian period. And we're going to shift from one to the other in our study today. We're ready to talk about the Feast of Belshazzar, the handwriting on the wall in chapter 5. That ends the Babylonian period in the history section. And then we'll move to Daniel in the lion's den in chapter 6. All right, let's go to question number 1 for today. Then we'll come back to our outline. Who is Belshazzar? All right. Nebuchadnezzar's son or grandson. Talk about that. The son of Nabonidus. We'll talk about that in a moment. And why is Nebuchadnezzar called his father? We'll talk about that here in just a moment. Let's go and get another question. What was written on the wall? Tekel? Upharsin. All right. Which means? Okay. Yes. Meaning that your kingdom is numbered and finished. Tekel meaning that your weight in the balances and found wanting, and Peres or Upharsin means simply that your kingdom has been divided with the Medes and the Persians. We'll get to all of that here in just a second. All right. This is chapter 5. 3 things happen in chapter 5. Actually, more than that. I don't know why I don't have these others up here. But what happens in chapter 5 is Belshazzar has a feast. There's this handwriting on the wall. We'll talk about who he is in just a moment. The queen suggests, and he's greatly disturbed, he's puzzled, and the queen suggests that he calls for Daniel to come and check what this is all about. Daniel gives his interpretation. Belshazzar and Babylon fall that very night. Now, this is something important to note right here at the beginning of chapter 5. We have fast forwarded a great deal in our last few since our last few chapters. In chapter 1, Daniel is a young man, 18 to 20 years of age. And then not long, I'm not sure how long that was, that we have the interpretation of the dream in chapter 2. But now in chapter 5, Daniel is 80 to 90 years old. And how do I know? Because Babylon falls. He went with the first group, and Babylonian captivity lasted how long? 70 years. So we've got to add 70 years to whatever age he was in Daniel chapter 1. Does that make sense? So this is 70 years later after chapter 1. So if he was 20, he's close to 90. If he was 15, you add 70 to that, and what's that? That's 85. So he's in his 80s or 90s at this point. So he's an old man by the time we get to chapter 5. Let's talk about Belshazzar now. Who is Belshazzar? The text calls him, let me get a list of the kings of Babylon here. These are kings of Babylon in the years in which they reigned. You see Nebuchadnezzar, the second in the list, and then his son Evil Merodach ruled after him. Come on down the line and you see Nabonidus next to the last. Who was Nabonidus? Nabonidus was a former priest under Nebuchadnezzar, and he married Nebuchadnezzar's daughter. And he had a son whose name was Belshazzar, mentioned here in the text. And he was a co-regent with Nabonidus at the time. What's a co-regent? They ruled at the same time. And so one could be said to be king, but so could the other said to be king and ruling and reigning, but they were co-regents. And so while Nabonidus was off, we understand, or at least history tells us he was off building temples, Belshazzar's running the kingdom, basically. And that's what's going on here. So the date of this chapter, and here's how I know this, or you tell me how I know. It's about 539 BC. How do I know that? I know that pretty certain. All right, absolutely. So I know 70 years have passed, and we notice that at verse 30, that the kingdom fell to the Medes and the Persians, so this is 70 years. And it fell in 539. So that puts me the date, pretty certain of the date. That's not guesswork. I'm not depending on a commentator. The text is telling me, not the number of the date, but it's telling me it's when Babylon fell. We know it fell in 539. So you might make a marginal note about that. Now, why is he called the son of Nebuchadnezzar? That's common in biblical language sometimes to refer to one who was your father or grandfather or great-grandfather as your father. That's not uncommon. The Hebrew term that's translated here, Brown, Driver, and Briggs, that's not a commentator, that's a lexicon, Hebrew lexicon that says that can mean father in the sense of the one who begot you, or it can have reference to ancestor. If you're reading from some translations that have a footnote for that word father, you'll notice that word father, the footnote will say ancestor. It just means and historically we know he was the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar, and that he was the son of Nabonidus. All right, for what that may be worth to us, let's move on and let's talk about this handwriting on the wall and the fall of Belshazzar. So let's get verses 1 to 4. I want to get to some pertinent points as we go along. So let's get verses 1 to 4. Belshazzar has a feast, the text tells us. And what's he doing in verses 1 to 4? Yeah, he has a drinking party in the presence of the 1,000 of his lords, and they tasted wine. And he gave the command to go bring the gold and silver which Nebuchadnezzar had taken. Now, for a reference on that, you might look at, I'm not going to take the time to go there, 2 Kings chapter 25. It was in that third invasion where they went in and got the gold from the temple and from the king's palace, etc. So they took the gold and the silver and all the utensils. That was on that third invasion after Daniel has already gone in. And who's present with him? This will help us identify somebody a little bit later. Verse 2. He has all of his lords and his wives and his concubines. Now, we'll see the significance of mentioning his wives here in just a moment. So then, at his command, they brought the gold and the silver. And what did they do with it once they brought the gold and the silver utensils and started drinking from them? All right, start praising the gods of gold and silver. Instead of the one true living God, they're praising the God of gold, silver, etc., stone and iron. All right, now let's go to verse 5. There's the handwriting on the wall that disturbed the king. Let's see what happens in the handwriting on the wall. There was a hand on the wall, according to verse 5. At the same hour, the finger of a man's hand appeared and wrote opposite of the lampstand on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw the part of the hand that wrote. Now, you stop and think about that. Let me find a picture that may give us kind of a picture of what's going on. Can you imagine being Belshazzar? And while you're drinking and partying, you see not a man, but you see a hand, the part of a man's hand, and you see a writing across the wall, on the plaster of the wall. And he doesn't know what it says. No one knows what it says yet. And you'll see perhaps why here in just a second. Any questions or comments on what's going on? He sees a handwriting on the wall. The record of the writing is in Aramaic here. Was it written in Aramaic, or is that just the translation we have of that? I'm not sure, and I'll tell you why I asked that question here in just a little bit. Let's get verse 6. What happens at verse 6 now? Yeah, he's very disturbed. Notice at verse 6, his thoughts troubled him, his joints of his hips were loosened, and his knees knocked together. One writer says one moment he's beating his chest, and the next moment his knees are beating together. Things have changed, haven't they? Big time. And then what does he do? Verse 7 and 8. They don't seem to learn from history too well, do they? In fact, Daniel's going to tell him, you haven't learned from history. He should have remembered from his the history that's been handed down that the astrologers and the interpreters and the wise men can't do that. Be that as it may, notice at verse 7, he offered him that he's going to be clothed in purple, that's royal colors, and a chain around his neck, and making the third rule of the kingdom. The idea of making him third ruler of the kingdom, I take that, though there is some question over that he'd be third in line, much like our Speaker of the House is third in line. Why would he be third in line? Because Belshazzar seems to be second in line, behind Nabonidus. Nabonidus is still in power and is the co-regent, and seems Belshazzar second, and I'll make you the third ruler of the kingdom. And now the wise men came, and what could they not do? Not only did they not know what it meant, they couldn't read it. Why? I don't know. It might have been of a different style. It might have been coded. We're not told why. When it's written, when the record of that is recorded for us in Aramaic, which this whole section is in Aramaic, was the writing in Aramaic? I don't know. Or is that the translation of what was written? I'm not sure. Why could they not read it? They might not understand it, but why could they not even read it and say, well, what it says is, but we don't understand it, we're not told. They couldn't even read it. They couldn't tell what it was. Now then, let's go to verse 10. This is why I mentioned the wives a moment ago. The queen comes and suggests that Belshazzar call for Daniel. Who is she? Well, I don't think it's his wife, because he had all of his wives in the banquet hall, didn't he? This is probably what has been referred to as Queen Mother, the wife of Nabonidus, his mother. She would also be called the queen because verse 10 says that she came to the banquet hall. She wasn't there when the handwriting took place, but she heard all the commotion. She heard all of the discussion about this handwriting, and she came, and so this is perhaps the wife of Nabonidus. I can't be certain for that. And what does she tell him? It's 11 and 12. Yeah, there's a man in your kingdom named Daniel that your father, that is your predecessor. By the way, some translation calls, instead of the word father, uses the word predecessor. The Holman's Christian Standard, I think. But be that as it may, your ancestor had this man in the kingdom who interpreted, and he's still here, and he's in your kingdom. Call for him, and he can tell you that. She would have remembered things concerning her father. This was her, that if it's Queen Mother, that is Nabonidus' wife, that's Nebuchadnezzar's daughter. That's the daughter of the man that went out and grazed like an animal. She had to know that story. She had to know. And remember, Dad went crazy and acted like an animal. And it had something to do with what Daniel was telling this man. And stories have been told about how he interpreted other things for my father. So call for him, down through verse 12. He'll give you the interpretation of that. Now let's get to the interpretation of that. Daniel gives his interpretation, and so Belshazzar calls for him. Now this is interesting. Before we get to the interpretation, look at verses 13 to 16. What does he say to him at verse 14, again at verse 16? Are you that Daniel? And then he says what? I have heard of you. I'd underline that. Powerful statement. When you meet somebody and they say, I have heard of you, what have they heard? Was it good? Was it bad? Is it that they've heard something that will be beneficial to them for you to be there? He said, I have heard of you. And he said, the wise men can't do anything about all of this. Verse 16, He said, I have heard of you, that you can give interpretation and explain enigmas. Some footnotes on explain enigmas at verse 16 can untie knots. You can take puzzles and figure them out. There are some things that are knotted up and we can't figure them out. And we understand you can take the knots and unravel all of the knots. You can do that. We hear that. Now, if you can read and make it known, then I'm going to give you all the gifts that I mentioned to everyone else. Verse 16. All right. Anything practical so far you learned? All right. Absolutely. Absolutely. Good question to ask. What have they heard concerning you? I have heard of you. Let's start at verse 17 now. Daniel refuses the gifts. In other words, I'm not interested in your gifts. That's not what I'm here for. In fact, keep those and give those to somebody else. One writer suggested Daniel is saying, I'm not for sale. That's interesting, isn't it? I'm not for sale. My soul's not for sale here. I'm going to tell you the message of that, and I'm not interested in being paid or rewarded for it. I'm going to tell you what the message is regardless of what you give me. Now, what does he tell him next? 18 to 22. This is powerful. Absolutely. He tells him, here's what happened to Nebuchadnezzar, your father. Here's what happened to him. He was a man of great power, and he did whatever he wanted to do, verse 19. But his heart was lifted up with pride, and he had given glory to himself. And he was driven from among men, what we saw in chapter 4, you remember that? He was driven from among men, and he ate grass like an oxen, until he knew, now you're ready to underline or mark or highlight. Until he understood what? Here's our message. Yeah, and gives it to whomever he will. Now look at verse 22. This is powerful. But you, his son Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, although you knew all this. Might underline that. That's powerful. I want to tell you something what we learned from that. We don't always learn from the mistakes of others. He didn't. He should have learned from this mistake of his grandfather and have been a better king, but he didn't learn. We don't learn from the people that went before us. In the church, history repeats itself time and again with apostasy. We don't learn that you go this direction, you go in the direction of error. So the next generation, what do? They go the same direction. He didn't learn. What else do you learn from that? Verse 22. People don't always do what they know they should do. He didn't say to Belshazzar, you didn't know that, and I know you were ignorant of that. He said, I know you knew it, and you still went this direction. People don't always do what they know. And here's something else I'm learning from that section, and that is there's a time to repeat and hear again what we already know. He already knew the story, but he told him the story again, didn't he? So you hear a story from the Bible, or you hear a message from the Bible, or you hear a warning, and you say, I've already heard that. Good, hear it again. Although you already know this, you need to hear it again. That's the point. All right, beginning at verse 23, what happens? He said, what you did was you lifted yourself up with pride, and you, God who holds your breath and owns all your ways, you have not glorified. Let me ask a practical question. If you go home this afternoon and you saw the handwriting on the wall, would it say you have not glorified God? That's what it told him. The handwriting basically said you hadn't glorified God. Had he glorified God, the handwriting on the wall wouldn't have been there, would it? Would the handwriting on the wall tell you you have not glorified God? All right, let's go to the writing and its meaning, beginning at verse 24. He said, the fingers of the hands man wrote this, and here is the expression, meeny, meeny, tekel, upharsin. All right? He said, here's the interpretation. Meeny means numbered. Follow your footnote if you have one, that literally a mina or shekel, it means to number, so it means you're numbered. In other words, your days are numbered, your kingdom is numbered. Then tekel, he says, it means that you have been weighed in the balance. It means to weigh out. So your days are numbered, you've been weighed in the balance, and you're found wanting. That's a powerful phrase. If you were put on the balance, would you be found wanting? And then the last phrase, upharsin, peris, is a form of the same word. It's the, by the way, well, I've lost my place. Upharsin is the plural of peris. So it's the same word. So you say, well, I thought it said upharsin, and then he mentioned peris. One is the plural, one's the singular form. And the peris just simply means your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. So Belshazzar gave the command to put all this around his neck and make him third ruler in the kingdom. I want to tell you, Belshazzar's reward was worthless, because his being third ruler of the kingdom lasted less than 6 hours. The world offers you promises, but a lot of the promises are worthless because they don't last very long. It didn't with here. Let's look at verse 30 and 31 and finish this chapter. What happens in 30 and 31? All right. That very night, Belshazzar, the king of the Chaldeans was a region of Babylon, south of the city of Babylon. And that very night, the king of the Chaldeans was slain, and Darius, the Mede, received the kingdom being about 62 years old. And we'll talk about Darius in a moment. Why isn't that Cyrus? We'll talk about that when we get to chapter 6. We'll just leave it that Darius now, the Medes have taken over. So that's how I know it's 539 BC. Babylon has fallen. Now, if we stopped right here and didn't study any more of the Bible, let's just forget the rest of it. What have I learned in light of Jeremiah, particularly in Isaiah? But Jeremiah particularly. What had Jeremiah been saying about Babylon? Yeah, not only they're coming and they're going to take you over, but before they even got into power, they're going to fall down there. 70 years later, he said. This wasn't 71. It wasn't 69. This was exactly 70 years later it fell. Make sense? Questions, comments? Practical things on chapter 5 quickly. We're going to get to chapter 6. What do you learn from chapter 5? Good point. Good point. If you didn't catch what she said, sometimes we call for people we want to hear from, but we need to call for people that we need to hear from. He needed to hear from Daniel. He didn't need to hear from his astrologers. That's who he called for first. Got time for one more before we go to chapter 6. Practical thing you take home with you. Say again. God keeps his promises. What'd you say, Dennis? At all times. Absolutely. Absolutely. All right. Let's go to chapter 6 now. Let's move on to chapter 6. And we are in chapter 6. We're moving to the Medo-Persian period. So we've just moved periods now. We're still in the history section. There's only one chapter devoted to this, and that's Daniel in the lion's den. We're all familiar with that. And so here's what we're going to have 4 points. Daniel, they plotted to kill Daniel. Daniel continues to pray and is reported to the king. He's cast in the lion's den, and then Darius decrees that all should fear Daniel's God. Let's talk about Darius. This may be a little confusing. When you come to this, you think, well, I thought I remember that Cyrus was the one that Isaiah had foretold in Isaiah 44 and 45, who would be the leader of the Medes that would allow the people to return. And he was the first leader. Cyrus was the universal leader. He's a universal ruler of the Medes and the Persians. Darius was over the province of Chaldea. So he was an underling, for lack of better expression. He was kind of an underling king Was he a king? Well, kind of like we had at some of the co-regions. But the ultimate emperor was Cyrus. And so let's get ahead of ourselves to the end of chapter 6. So Daniel prospered in the reign of Darius and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. Make sense? One was the more universal ruler, and the other ruled up under him. And so let's see what happens now in chapter 6. With that in mind, what do we see beginning at verse 1? Let's go to verses 1 to 9. Here's the plot to kill Daniel. That didn't go over too well, did it? Very, very much, that's very true. Look at verse 1. He had 120 satraps. Those are, for lack, again, of better expression, just more underling rulers, leaders in various regions around. And he set 3 governors over all of those satraps. Daniel was one of 3. And there was thought, verse 3, what did Darius think about? Must have done more than thinking, because the others found out about it. Must have been talking about it. Yeah, he's thinking about setting him over the other governors. In other words, here's 3, and maybe we'll make him kind of the chief governor over all the others. That ain't going to go over too well. It didn't go over well. Perhaps for a couple of reasons. Jealousy may be one thing, but some have suggested that maybe their life was complicated by his righteous living. That here they go in this direction, they go in another direction, but Daniel is pretty much a stickler, not pretty much, he is a stickler for doing things right and keeping on the course. And that may have been a problem that created some of this. But nonetheless, let's go further. Look at verses 4 and 5. Verse 6 to 9. They go to Darius, and what do they say to Darius? All right. Let's go back to verse 5. This is interesting. Then these men said, we shall not find any charge against this Daniel. Let's just stop there for a moment. Daniel is an old man. He's been there he's been off in captivity for at least 70 years. And they said, we can't find any fault with him. He hasn't done anything during all this time. That tells me it wasn't that he was faithful for a while and he fell away and then he came back. Daniel's had his integrity the whole time. Does that make sense? He's never give up on that. Number 2, I'm learning from that they can't find anything wrong with what he's doing except maybe something to do with the law of his God. What does that mean? All right. Somebody else said something. Yeah. It's not that they're going to find him violating the law of his God. It's just the opposite. That we can take the law of his God and have him do something, command him to do something contrary to the law of God, and we know Daniel well enough, there's going to be a conflict. Daniel won't cave to the pressure, and now we've got him. Now stop and think about that. If somebody made a law out to get you, and it was contrary to the law of your God, would they get you? Or would they know that you're going to cave to the pressure? That's interesting, isn't it? Would you cave to the pressure? We're going to make a law that makes them violate the law of their God, and let's see what they do. That's what they're doing with Daniel. We're going to make a law contrary to the law of his God, and we'll see what he does with that. Well, we do see what he does. And so the decree, what do we learn, and where did we learn this? That the Medes and the Persians, when they had a law or a decree, it could not be undone or reversed. Where have we seen that before? Not in chronological time, but in our studies, we've already looked at it, though it comes later. In the book of Esther, yes, there was a decree concerning the killing of the Jews. Couldn't be taken back, but something has to be done to offset it. Can't change the law. That's the nature of their law. So King Darius signed the decree. Beginning now at verse 10, Daniel continues to pray, and it's reported to the king. So look at verse 10. What did Daniel do? When he knew the decree was signed, what did he do? He went and prayed. And he prayed openly. Went to his house with the windows open, facing toward Jerusalem, and kneeled down on his knees, and he prayed 3 times that day and gave thanks to God, as was his custom since the early days. That tells me he didn't make a show because of this decree. This is what he's been doing all along. He's not stopped doing that. This is not a show for the time. I'm just not going to stop because they threatened me. I'm going to keep doing what I've always done. We learn a lot about prayer in that. Now, beginning at verse 11, what do you see? All right. They saw that, and they went and reported it to the king, and they tell the king, didn't you make a law? And, oh, yeah, we made a law. And didn't you say it's irreversible? Yeah, it's irreversible. Well, let me tell you about this one captive. Look at verse 13 of Judah, that he shows no regard for you, O king, but he makes petition 3 times a day to his God. And what was the king's reaction, verse 14? Why? Yeah, he knew that my decree is irreversible. He's greatly displeased with himself that he's made that decree. I should have thought this through, perhaps. You ever make a decision and then look back and say, I wished I'd have thought this through before I committed to that? He's displeased with himself about his decision. And he labored to the going down of the sun to try to do something, but they reminded him, verse 15, here's how our law works, king. It's irreversible. Isn't that what he says, verse 15? All right. So beginning at verse 16, Daniel's cast into the lion's den. And what did the king say at verse 16? This is quite impressive. Yeah, notice this expression. He uses it twice. You might underline it, verse 16, drop down to verse 20, you'll see the same expression. They brought Daniel to him, and he wants to talk to Daniel first. He said, your God, whom you serve continually. Now that's in harmony with this expression at verse 10 over here, since the early days. You serve him continually. I know you do. You have always. Let's get ahead of ourselves. Verse 20, the God whom you serve continually. But he said, I think he'll be able to deliver you. Now, here's something I'm learning about Darius. Darius had faith in God, but his actions don't match his words, do they? I believe in your God. I believe the God of Daniel. I believe that he's able to deliver you. But then why was he worshiping these gods of gold and silver and stone and of wood, etc.? I believe in your God. I believe he's got power. His actions don't match his words. All right, what else happens? Down through verse 18, or through verse 23. Isn't it interesting that what he does in the morning? Now, he didn't sleep that night. He's worried about Daniel. But he goes and he calls out to Daniel. Why did he call out to Daniel?
Seems like he had a little bit of faith.
Yeah. Seems like he's expecting maybe, just maybe, Daniel's still going to be alive in the lion's den. Now, these are ferocious lions. How do I know they're ferocious? What they did to the others, yeah. And Daniel was spared from all of that. Now notice at verse 23, at the end of verse 23, he found there was no injury on him whatsoever. What's the last phrase? Because he believed in his God. I'm telling you, what I learned about believing in God is more than a mental acknowledgement. Look at that phrase again. Because he believed in his God. Believing in God is more than a mental acknowledgement. Oh yeah, I know there's a God. I believe there's a God. He believed in his God, and what that means is he served God continually. Verse 16. Verse 20, he served God continually. And verse 10, he prayed as was his custom since the early days. It helps me to understand what it means he believed in God. Because he believed in God, he was faithful and diligent all the days of his life. So the king gave command that they bring him up, and now verse 24. What happens in verse 24? That's interesting that not only the accusers who wanted to see this happen to Daniel, now it happens to them. Quite often that is the case. When I want to destroy someone, I end up destroying myself. And their families. Good point. And so I'm wanting to destroy someone else, but now I end up destroying me and my family in the process. A captive. Yeah. They had no respect for him. Good point. They had no respect for Daniel. That is, his accusers had no respect for him. All right, they're cast into the lion's den. Now what happens in the rest of the chapter? Verses 25 to 28. All right, what's the decree? These kings are fickle that we've been looking at, aren't they? This is the same king said, I'll write a decree, says, worship nobody but me. And now worship nobody but the God of Daniel, which he already knew about. He already knew about him. To all people. Now, this is interesting to me. He said he's the living, I'm reading at verse 26, he's a living God and steadfast forever. His kingdom is one that shall not be destroyed. How do you know that? I don't know the answer to that. I have some speculation. But this is Belshazzar saying this. I mean, not Belshazzar, it's Darius saying this. And he's saying the God of Daniel has a kingdom that'll never be destroyed. It may be he's assuming that because a God that this powerful, I've heard stories about this Daniel, and if he's got a kingdom, then it'll never be destroyed. But it very well may be if he knew about the events of Nebuchadnezzar, he might have also known about the statue, but there's something else earlier, chapter 2, the dream of Nebuchadnezzar. And part of the interpretation would be, verse 44, there would be a kingdom that would never be destroyed. You might have heard about that. Well, let's finish with verse 28. Daniel prospered in the reign of Darius and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. Cyrus was the one that turned him loose and let him go, by the way. He is the overall ruler. He's in power. And Darius is underneath him. Questions or comments now? Very good, very good. Look at verse 20. Same thing in verse 16. Whom you serve God continually. Serve the living God continually. What an epitaph to be written. Could that be written on your tombstone? Here lies one who served God continually. Powerful, powerful. What else do you learn from chapter 6? Practically, take home. Good point. Daniel was a young man, very young, and had pressure, and he stood. He has pressure at age 85 to 90, and he stood under the pressure. He served God continually, didn't he? One more practical lesson. What do you got? Good point, good point. We'll stop there, chapters 7 and 8 next time.